I have been thinking lately and reflecting on the door knocking efforts that we've engaged in. Last Saturday, we participated in the nationwide effort here locally, and back in the summer, earlier in the summer, we had the week-long campaign of knocking doors, and I know there are individuals that are involved in that, on a year-round basis and are continuing to go out. But I think if you're like me, sometimes it's easy that we fall in the danger of convincing ourselves that somehow the 21st century is not like the first century, and people just aren't as receptive to hearing the gospel from people that they don't know today as compared to how things were in the first century. And it's kind of a dangerous thing. After I started thinking about this and looking at this, after I'd actually prepared my thoughts, I did find, if you're familiar with this house-to-house and heart-to-heart that we have out on the table in the foyer, if you actually go to their website, it's not in the publication, but if you go to their website, there's an article that was written by Alan Webster, and it's titled, "Have We Outgrown the Bible?" And it's actually a pretty good article if you want to look at that some more. Same kind of thought. Have we, is today different than it was in the first century? But as I think about that, I think about the responses that we receive primarily when we go out and we encounter people, the types of people that we meet and the responses that they give. And, one of the most prevalent responses we get is just that I'm not interested. And I think about that, and it's really not that different than what the Athenians told Paul in Acts 17, verse 32, when they said, we'll hear of you some other time about these things. Or even more pointedly, Felix, if you remember what he told Paul in Acts 24, he said, a more convenient time I'll call for you. And that's essentially what people are saying when they tell us, for whatever reason that that now is not a good time, that they are not interested. Sometimes you will encounter either snide remarks or sneers or mocking, and we think back to the disciples or the apostles on the day of Pentecost. They were being mocked as being full of new wine. And again, the Athenians, talking to Paul, they referred to him as an idle babbler. And it says there in verse 32 of Acts 17 that they were actually sneering at him when they dismissed him. So it's not really that different from what Paul experienced. Sometimes we might encounter just direct opposition. If you look in Acts 18 and verse 6, the Corinthians were directly resisting Paul and blaspheming. And, we might encounter some people that, whether family members or friends, that they may try to dissuade others. If you're talking to two people, and sometimes you might have someone in the house that doesn't want anyone else to hear. But just if you recall that Elymas, the sorcerer on Cyprus, was trying to dissuade the proconsul of Cyprus from listening to Paul in Acts 13 and verse 8. And one that's encountered fairly frequently is what you might refer to as religious debaters. And those that just want to talk, and they want to possibly argue, but just debate religion. And the Athenians that Paul encountered in the 17th chapter of Acts, that's what they enjoyed doing. They just wanted to hear something new, to hear and tell something different, something new. And that must have been a prevalent issue, because in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 7, Paul warned Timothy about people like this, and he said, always learning but never coming to a knowledge of the truth. And we encounter that today also. And sometimes we encounter people who are good and sincere hearts, but maybe just need to be further instructed. And you think about Apollos, they're being instructed by Priscilla and Aquila in Acts 18, or the 12 disciples that Paul encountered in Ephesus, that he needed to tell more fully about Jesus and about what they needed to do to be responsive to him in the 19th chapter of Acts. And those of you that go out and door knock, on a frequent basis. You may have others, but I think if we think about the types of responses that we get, that we will find that the disciples, the apostles, were receiving the same kind of response in the first century. The one thing that we don't see that we should be thankful for is violent persecution. Think about Paul being stoned in his first missionary journey in Lystra in Acts 14. And that's prevalent throughout the travels that we read of Paul and of the other apostles, that they encountered many such circumstances like that. And we can be thankful that we don't encounter that. But what we are seeking when we are going out and approaching people, we're seeking, the Ethiopian eunuchs, or from Acts chapter 8, or the Cornelius of Acts 10, or Lydia in chapter 16, or the Philippian jailer in chapter 16. And even, I mentioned a couple of times the response that Paul received from the Athenians, Dionysius and Damaris of Athens were good and tender hearts that even in an environment full of people who were uninterested and dismissive and ridiculing Paul, and wanted to just debate continually, that those hearts were found by Paul and were receptive. And so it is, as Jesus said in Luke 8 and verse 15, it's the good and honest hearts is what we're seeking. I think there's a fitting parable for where we find ourselves is in Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 8. Jesus says there, "Or what woman, if she has 10 silver coins and loses one, does not light a lamp and sweep the house and search carefully until she finds it? When she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin which I had lost.' In the same way, I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents." And so that's really what we're doing, is we're continuing to sweep our house in this area, looking for that lost, that precious lost soul. And I think in terms of perspective, it occurs to me that I looked it up, and the distance actually between, as the crow flies, between Antioch, where Paul was originally sent out from, and Rome, where he ended his life, is 1,300 miles. And so Paul, the Apostle Paul, traveled in not in a direct route, but in many more miles than that entire region of the world, taking rejection, being mistreated, but searching and sweeping and looking for those lost souls that we read about in Acts. And so, we should think about, why should we continue to do this? In Luke chapter 8, we know the parable of the soils. And the thing that I think we should consider is that soils can change. And, a heart that was hard, that was a stony ground, today may be the heart that is the fertile, receptive soil sometime later. And so as a result, we need to continue to, as the parable in Luke 15 says, we need to continue to sweep and look and rejoice when we do find the sinner that repents and turns. So just some thoughts about what we've been engaged in. But looking as we're here tonight, us together here tonight, if we look at that parable in Luke chapter 8 about the soils and thinking about the fact that soils can change, and we also have to apply that to ourselves, that our soils can be changed. And I think that's one of the main points that Jesus is making in that parable, is to look to yourself as to what type of soil and how receptive we are. And so we're going to sing an invitation song here in a moment, and I would ask you, if you know what you need to do to be to be right with God, if you know the things that you've been studying, you know the things that you need to do, that you would choose to be receptive and put aside the things of this world and not let cares choke that out, but not be hard-hearted, but that you would choose to be that good and honest soil that Jesus spoke about. Or if you have put Christ on in baptism and maybe the cares of this world have started to choke out the light that you began with, we're here also to help you with that. And we can pray for you in that instance also. So whatever your case may be, if you need anything, if you would come as we stand and sing.